It's
okay. I started.
Okay.
Okay.
Welcome to England. A long way away, but I carry memories of 3 visits to Taiwan and one most recently to your city and to the sites that you're talking about. And I found them very exciting. The first time I went to Taiwan 15, 20 years ago, I asked about what evidence was there of the war. And there wasn't much evidence, and nobody was talking about it very much. Now, of course, 20 years later, because of generational change, people are talking about it. Heritage comes alive again about the time when people are dying who knew about it. It's transferred from people talking about it to professionals talking about it, and you're the professionals. So what I'd like to do is to, first of all, relate a little bit of my view from here now. I'm stuck in a lockdown in COVID, and I have to think this is a crisis similar to a war. It is a war. In fact, I was born during the Second World War, and a number of times people have said to me, how does this relate? Well, I was only 3 during the war, but I can just remember diving into shelters to avoid bombing. I can just remember how my parents reacted and what they did. And life was managed and controlled in a way in which it's now managed and controlled in Britain with COVID. We had bombs which were called V1 bombs, which were not directional bombs. They just came over and dropped. You didn't know where they were coming from. And similarly, during COVID, of course, we have a massive rise in infection. So there's an unknown enemy just outside my window. And it's watching a government respond to this and build structures and manage things, which 50 years' time, in your lifetime, but not mine, people will start saying, we must memorialize, we must make markers to remember that period in our lives. So I was coming from a point of thinking about what we're doing now with COVID and how it reflects on what we want to preserve with regard to World War II. And that's really what the first part of my paper was about. It has definitions which are better probably dealt with in your language, and I'm sure your colleagues are going to do that. But I talked about ways in which things are marked, and I talked about memory. And I think the only thing I'd like to say at the beginning here about memory is that in the design professions, we tend to take as our subject the tangible built form or very much tangible elements of the environment. But of course, these are only the products of decisions and ideas. And the memory which people have, especially the general public have, is much deeper than just of the monuments. The monument or the building does not satisfy all the needs of somebody who has memories. So the first lesson perhaps today is to really track back into the memories which people have of the buildings and environments you're talking about. Now, I know when I was there before that there were people around, for example, who'd lived in the factory, the big factory we looked at. The whole living area, it was a whole culture. There was a whole life. A generation had lived there. They held memories which they passed on to their children. Some of them are about buildings, which are markers, but some of them are about the way time was used, the way space was used, the way paths were used, the way access was used, where boundaries were. And these were boundaries established largely by the Japanese forces. Now, they may not have written them down, but that pattern, which was imposed by Japanese occupation, still lasts somewhat in people's memories. And the important thing, I think, is to not only save monuments, not only save buildings, but think about patterns, access, boundaries, and whether those can be reinforced in design. Now, that to you may sound very complicated, but I think it's fantastically liberating. I think it's something which is really exciting, because we're not just stuck with how to raise the money to save a building or how to reuse it, but we have some hints from the past as to how land may be apportioned, how routes may be created, how boundaries in design terms might be established. A whole repertoire of ideas from the past is available. And I think the challenge to you in this project is not only think of the buildings, but think of the functions during that wartime period and how people might have structured their lives in space, and because urban design is about time as well as space, within time. In COVID here in England, at the moment, we're allowed out of our house 1 hour a day, basically, to exercise. Other things are happening in time. And those time conditions may affect for the next generation how they operate. My grandchildren in school will be marked for life by the time conditions which they're being given today. And there may be boundaries, for example, which they're not passing over. There may be access ways which they're using now for the first time, which will stick with them. Now, I'm not saying that these things dictate how we design, but they're hints. They're ideas, part of that culture. So, yes, somebody said to me on this Zoom, it's quite philosophical. Well, this is, I wouldn't say philosophical, but nevertheless quite deep, because A, it's one of the things I can do at distance. I can't stand over your drawing board. I can't walk around the studio, which I'd love to do, but I can at least raise some issues, most of which are in the academic literature, about how we see space and how memory acts on space. There's an International Journal of Heritage Studies, which I'm sure is available online for you. And especially the Australians, for some reason, have been doing a great deal of work on this question of the relationship between memory and space. And you may want to dig into that at some point, just to get ideas, to reinforce ideas. At the end of my paper, and I'll say it now and I'll say it again at the end, here is this bearded old academic in England saying things which don't seem to fit in with what I do in the studio and in projects. He's only concerned about the economics, the sociology of it. No, that's not true. When it comes to designing, I can criticize, other people can criticize. The essence of design when it comes to actually doing this job is to be creative. And I find heritage not limiting. Preservation is not a limiting activity, it's a liberating activity. There are so many ideas once we start digging into the past, often in ways which we haven't done previously, which are really important to stimulate your thought. You may come up with the most modern structures in the world. Hopefully you do, because they've got to last 50 years. But they may have reference in pattern, in plan, in routes, in entrances, in elevations to the past. Only you may know them, but what you're doing is seeding into the future your perception of the past. Now, I don't think that's too difficult to understand. And I think you must agree it's a liberating activity. So that is the essence of the first part of my paper, where I talk about what's happening in COVID in Britain. It's been surprising that we've produced a design guide, which usually take 10 years to produce. Everybody knows consultations on design guides. They take a long, long time. This one has been produced in several editions within a year. And you've got copies, I think, on illustrations which are coming up, of how the detail in which changes are being proposed for Britain's high streets. Now, my point here is that there is a design guide under crisis, interesting perhaps to you, but interesting to me, because for the rest of my life, those elements, even though they're said only to be temporary, many of them will survive for 10 or 20 years, beginning to shape things. This whole idea of distancing, the whole idea in Britain of people walking down one side of the sidewalk or the other. Anybody who's been to England knows that we are not very good at behaving on sidewalks. We mix up. Will this proposal and the illustrations in the streets where there are tapes on the streets mean that suddenly a whole population is changing their fundamental behavior in towns? Now that's, you could say, just something for a crisis, or you could say that's a fundamental change in human behavior in the urban space, which is going to be with us for 10, 20 years, at least a generation. Things were happening during the war which had just that effect. And one of the challenges in this project is not only to look at the buildings, not only look at the spaces, not only to be the archaeologist and find the past in physical form, it's to find these ideas, these guidances, which may have existed then. Certainly not for design reasons, but for military reasons. But I think they may be there. So that was the essence of the first part of my paper. The second part of my paper, and I don't know how we're going to deal with this, but I would then carry on if I were standing before you today and show the images which are going to come up now, I think. And those images, I've just chosen 20 to illustrate, not directly often. Again, there are ideas behind them because, for example, none of, or so few of them don't refer to buildings, they refer to ideas, but they're just to stimulate your thought as to what may be happening around you in Taiwan at the moment. And I know sufficient much about Taiwan to know that some of these will reflect things that are there. So, for example, the use of temporary graphics in towns. I include one illustration of a seat in Germany, which says, "Out of bounds to Americans and Allied forces." That was a wartime, just post-war occupation symbol, which was still there 30 years later. So these pieces of information embedded in the landscape are still there to see today, as are many physical remnants. I think of the illustrations, which I'm looking at the list now just to see what I've done, many of them are self-explanatory. Just running down, with regard to COVID, it's going to be very interesting to see what survives, because most of the structures that are being erected for COVID are intended to be temporary, the large hospitals and things like this, as during the war. And many of the things were destroyed in the war anyway, but their locations are known. Then I went on, I just wanted to really highlight one or two. I get to the end of the illustrations, after the one from Germany. Just looking at those, I've got the observatory in Hiroshima. You all know that building. It's the one that survived in Hiroshima and stands there just as it was bombed. So you can see it. That is an icon. It's a large structure. It had a function. It speaks of the destruction of Hiroshima in the end of the war. The next one is a bridge in Bosnia, which I did quite a lot of work on. There's a report on it. I did it for UNESCO. And it was a bridge that was deliberately bombed in the war in Bosnia because it connected two sides. Highly symbolic. It was a connection between two communities and was deliberately bombed. And immediately after the war in Bosnia, international money was put in to put the bridge back. Symbolic. A bridge is a very symbolic feature. You can see why. I then got one or two examples of how people have dealt with, for example, one of Coventry. Coventry was so severely bombed during the Second World War that all they did was to gather the pieces of old buildings together and put them in one street. You'll see the illustration. They're old buildings in a city which is entirely modern around. I'm not sure that's a very brilliant idea these days, moving pieces to one place and making parks. I'm rather against those. I think they tend to put boundaries around heritage, and I think heritage should be in the environment. Kinmen is so interesting that it's an entirely separate world. If you've been to Kinmen, you know what I'm talking about in terms of evidence of a military society there and how that landscape is formed. But I also show, just after Kinmen, a little building in the Shetlands in Scotland. Now, the Shetlands are a group of islands right at the extent of Scotland. They're wild, they're detached, people live there. And there's this little bunker, you'll see, there's one slide, it's number 20 in my list. And it's the most basic defensive structure. It's just a concrete box. Terribly important in Shetland because they did have defenses, they had military functions, but because of the society, that is quite symbolic. In many other places, they've been torn down, they're not really recognized. So there's a valuation here in terms of the rarity of an item and how it works with the local community. And I come back to the community here. The community element is really so important. Now, the third part of my paper is about discussion points. And I think that's where we enter in dialogue, because I rather suspect that we won't get through all of these. And these are things that you could discuss as well as I could. But it seemed to me, after exploring this little journey, that there were 3 or 4 big questions to ask and for you to make a decision about. These are not ultimate answers. And the first one says, how important is it to emphasize past memories and why? Why do we bother? And at times in societies, the idea of looking at the past is discounted. Any politician who wants to make his mark often discards the past and says, I'm for the future. So why we have to ask, do we want to look at past memories and the buildings that underline those past memories? And I said, first of all, to learn to do things better next time. They are reminders of human error. Should we have allowed this to happen? They validate past landscape elements under threat. Memories can be called in to reinforce the desire to save things. Memories are a fantastic bank behind tangible objects if we care to use them. It may be political in terms of political debate, but it is in terms of public awareness. The third thing is that we can learn from innovations created in conflict and crisis. As I said earlier, we have a design guide for streets during COVID, which was produced in less than a year by professionals who in peacetime would have taken 5 years to do it. And it's quite innovative in what it covers. We know that crisis develops innovation fast, and we've got to learn from all the innovations that were used. The innovations of the attacker, the innovation of the defender, the innovations of people who just live through it. And as I said earlier, which is important, to recapture useful but neglected patterns of use and behavior. We tend to forget these, and they're there just waiting for us if we want them. So the textbook is often not a book or not documents, but just thinking about what was happening at that time. And actually, it's much easier as a student to listen to your professor or to read a book than to actually think about something. But I think this project particularly demands that you think as well. You really put yourself back into the position of people living in your city at that time. How was it? Yes, you can perhaps talk to people who have memories, but just think it through. How would you feel? What would you have done? Put yourself in that position. So memories are terribly important. We all have them. We don't tend to use them for professional purposes, but here I'm suggesting you do. The second question I raise is why and where do we need physical markers? Why do we need physical markers? To alert memories. They trigger memories. They're, I suppose, every bit of urban design that we all know concerns that basic structure of cities, Kevin Lynch's structure, which includes landmarks, and they're important landmarks. Physical marks suggest human activity or past concerns. They alert memories, but they also suggest patterns we don't know much about. And they do preserve evidence, and evidence is important. Then comes the question, are buildings worth preserving? And I suppose this is the nub, because ultimately, anything you do in this project has got to be costed. Well, we've got to find political support for it, and it has to be costed. And often we go immediately to cost and say we can't do that, costs too much, that costs too little. I think you've got to ask, why are we preserving or conserving something before you decide whether or not we can afford it? You've got to develop a strong rationale for the investment. And I've suggested in my notes that, are they iconic? Iconic buildings, buildings which stand to represent community ideas, city ideas, political ideas, are important. You only have to look at what happened in American Congress within the last 24 hours to realize how important iconic structures are. The Capitol building in Washington is known to every American. Every American student, certainly my wife visited it when she was at school. There is an iconic structure. And yesterday it was invaded. Everybody knew where it was. That's an extremely important structure. But there are local structures like that as well. In England, the pub which closed. In Taiwan, I'm not sure what those might be, but you will have iconic structures within your lifestyle, which you know are important. I think the second point about buildings worth preserving is that they should be experienced as well as just seen. Up until the 1950s or 60s even, there was the tendency to preserve buildings, to lock up their doors and treat them as objects. You couldn't afford to let people go into them. You couldn't afford to let people use them or change them. They had to be exactly as they always had been. And that means that most people can't in any way own that building. They can't feel part of it. One's always got to think, can we not only preserve this, but make it usable today in some way? So that is my next point, really, my third point on this heading, which was, can these buildings be used for a contemporary purpose? Well, we can only have so many art galleries and craft shops, which seem to be the major things which are established all over the place. But there are many contemporary purposes, and we have to think very carefully whether we can do that so that buildings become a new part of the community. It's interesting in Britain at the moment because we have this question of immunization centers, that it's seriously being considered, for example, that churches can be used for immunization centers, which suddenly gives them a new use where religion is rather in decline. So most people do not have a relationship with church buildings, of which we have a very large number. Every small community has an ancient church. I'm saying this within 5 minutes walk. I have a building of the 13th century up in the village. Now that's unused at the moment. I mean, it's used for church services by a few, but perhaps it can be reused for an immunization center, for a food bank or something, and it gives a contemporary purpose. And that brings really the big point about preservation, that it shouldn't just serve the professions, giving architects and planners a job. It shouldn't just serve a generation of politicians who get a good reputation out of putting money into it. It should serve the social and economic life of the local community. Because if it does that, its purpose will stay and grow. If it's politicians who invest in something just for a short while to get fame from it, then when they vanish as politicians, most people forget it. If it's for academics to get a few credits or professional designers to get a few credits, it'll be a job, they'll go on to the next job. The people who keep heritage alive are local communities and users who build that structure into their lives. And I think that's the key thing you have to think of in terms of how you move on in your project. I had to raise the question, which I'm ill-equipped to answer, which is, how important will heritage be in the electronic future? All around me are books and papers. Just up above me is a drawing, a picture that I'm just about to finish. My wife has to help me with things like Zoom. I have electronic equipment which I've never quite mastered. I'm not of the electronic generation. You are, most of you. You see things differently. You explore space differently. You use landmarks differently. You use knowledge differently. You use time differently. Most of the instructions as to how to preserve are dominated by people of your professor's generation rather than yours. It's going to change. Only you can tell us how it's going to change. I found Pokemon Go very interesting in that regard, in that when the game was at full pelt, there were people wandering around cities, visiting churches and buildings, not because they were historic buildings, but because they were on Pokemon Go. But that's a very important insight into how people might use things in future. 50 years' time, remember, we're going to be a different world. Artificial intelligence is going to dominate a lot of what we do from time to time. You have to think of what's heritage going to look like in the future. Oh, thank you. Pour us a glass of water.
Anything else?
No, it's fine. The last point I wanted to make, which is really the one I think we can discuss. What are the most useful tools for marking conflicts and crisis memory in the future? So it comes down to the pointer at the end. What should we be concentrating on? And I suggested sort of a two-way thing to this. Icons are still important. As long as we move in urban space or rural space, we need markers, whether we're walking, driving, zooming, flying in helicopters or whatever. We need icons, a good pattern of icons. Equally, it's useful to have roots, patterns, and boundaries which build on the past experience. So that's another area to look at. Local markers, which are less than icons, smallest of things, which are important to local people. And that can mean monuments which are made to commemorate, which may mark what I call usable memory places. In Taipei, there's a square with a marker which plays music. I will always remember it. It's for a famous Taiwanese singer, and there is the marker, and you press a button and it plays the music which he composed in that area. It's very minor. I've not seen it referred to in any of the literature, except I've written about it and taken photographs of it. It's a brilliant idea. You have to remember all the senses, and there, that links him to that old area, most of which has vanished. There are one or two old buildings. So think creatively about how one makes usable memory places. Is it light? Is it sound? Is it touch? There's a great variety of ways in which the designer can make memorable places which reflect the past. Time is going, so I've got 4 no-nos, things not to do. And your professors are going to argue with me about this. I think the worst thing you can do is high cost, non-community preservation. High cost preservation, which the local community doesn't want anyway. That's the worst thing to do. Large memorial structures, much loved of politicians. That's another thing not to do. Introducing a lot of obscure names from the past, street names, place names, which people don't tend to remember unless it's surrounded by some more information. And now this all adds up to not creating brave new squares in commemoration of something without providing enough information so people know why that square has been created. There's always a tendency to have a Memorial Plaza, and unless you know why the Memorial Plaza is there, then it's really a waste of time. You might as well just discount the memorial bit. As I said at the beginning, a lot of these ideas are not initial drawing board ideas. I know it's not the drawing board anymore, it's the computer screen, but you know what I'm talking about. They're not things that you and I could discuss immediately over the drawing board, but they all influence the way you think about this project at the beginning. It's a very exciting project. I was amazed when I first was introduced to it, and we had a great time for a couple of days exploring these things. And I wish I was back there, and maybe I'll get back to see your product when that ends. I'd like to come again, but at the moment I'm stuck in a grey day in England with frost on the ground, and it's just a joy to be talking to Taiwan. It brings back a lot of good memories. So thank you very much for having me, and I think we're now going to hopefully have a couple of questions. Okay?
Okay.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's wonderful. I think that the talk is very clear. And I can have 3 questions, then we can have some conversation.
Okay.
Number 1 is you're talking about the memory.
Yeah.
Actually, in the last about 10 years, I have brought different group of like a tour guide to the site. And actually for the outsiders, they have never come to that place. So some people raise the question that here's a totally new place for us. We don't have any connection. We don't have any memory of that place. Yeah. But it seems the title of the World War II heritage is quite symbolic. But how can we get the memory of that place? I think
when I was with you, the one thing that struck me most was the photograph of the girls who lived there. Do you remember?
Yes.
On the staircase.
Yes.
The old photograph and the new photograph. You remember those 2 photographs?
Yes. Yeah, yes, I do.
That sticks in my memory more than anything else, because it said, here are a group of girls whose lives must have been pretty terrible, like mine was at the beginning, because they were born in the war. I think all of those girls would have been born in the war. And here they were making a home in the factory. And here they were now, you know, respected ladies. It's their lives, which is actually the memory I have of that place. Now I know that's not the memory of the building, but that leads me to the memory of the building. In my mind, as I say that, I'm walking around that floor where the houses were. I'm walking into the big chamber.
Yes.
I have no notes on this. I have no photographs of this as it happens, but I can remember all that. I remember it on the back of people. So although we're in business to preserve, to restate heritage, it's the memories, I think, of people and the human experience that is the vehicle by which we can do that. And you still have people who are alive who lived in that building, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So oral history is terribly important in beginning to stimulate people who don't know a place. So recordings of oral history, life stories, etc., are absolutely crucial in bringing that place alive. Otherwise, it's merely a rather unattractive piece of military history. You know, I mean, aircraft fuel is not the sexiest subject.
No.
A group of young girls on a stairway is.
Yeah.
So I think on that and other sites, there's a lot of interviewing to be done. There's a lot of talking to people, a lot of recording, and picking out of those recordings things that they mention. That's the way in. It's the way in. And it can be done, obviously, by guide. Tour guides are best to do this because they can repeat part of the story. But we have to think creatively about how voices can be incorporated. There's a very interesting, in Coventry, there's a very interesting recreation of a small area of the cathedral surroundings, which was bombed, where you walk in and via laser or light connections, voices of people come through as you walk through, just very briefly. Not long, just short bursts, you know. But to walk into that building and hear a girl's voice say, "This is where we played such and such." You know, it immediately says to you, what's happening here? I've got to juggle with this. I've got to think this one through. So I think for all the professional knowledge we have, and I know research you've done, the oral history is an important way in to memory.
Okay. Actually, we have done some collection of the old photographs and some interviewing of those old residents. But by now, that is still kept in the government report. So actually, actually what we are thinking is how we use those materials to make popular to ordinary peoples that maybe can help peoples to link to those places where they don't have any memory of it.
Well, I think certainly looking at sound light systems which are activated when people walk past them, they must exist. I mean, they must be in the technology of exhibitions. And I think there's a whole area there. I can imagine that building. You know, as you walk through, there is some written guidance, but at points, voices say what was happening. There's the Japanese military man saying what happened. There is the young girl, there's the refugee, there's the worker. You can imagine about 6 or 8 voices in that building who are triggered at various times. When you're looking at something and you say, what the hell is this, you know? And they say, this is where I did this, or this is where I did that. Well, you'd have to invent some of it, but I think it's very important to try and use authentic voices if you can.
Okay. The question 2 is, currently the Taiwanese local government, they have a committee to justify those buildings which people has suggested to rank it or mark as historic architecture or historic building. But basically, they evaluate based upon the architectural quality or architecture uniqueness, rather than any form of any materials of memories of those things. I'm curious that in UK, do they evaluate buildings' value as certain parts is based upon the indigenous or the non-materials part?
Yeah, I mean, it's an absolutely intriguing question. You realize that UNESCO, for the first part of its life, evaluated buildings purely as buildings.
Yes.
And then, of course, it realized that many countries didn't have a building culture. They had a non-material culture. So now UNESCO has the other listings, which list foods, dances, customs, etc. Now, why did that happen? It happened because the old professors who were in charge, who were buildings and architecture people, wanted it just to exist for buildings. Exactly the same happened in England. Like, I'm living within, excuse me, 30 miles of where it happened. During the war, Second World War, we had a camp, a secret camp in Milton Keynes, actually the new town. It wasn't the new town then, it was just the countryside, where they decoded German messages. And there was several big buildings. And they decoded German messages, and they got hold of a Enigma machine from the Germans. They captured it to decode German messages. These were put on a computer by a man called Alan Turing. And Alan Turing was the father of computer technology. He was also gay. He was also gay, and was in fact taken to court for being gay in the 1950s, I think, and died. Attitudes have changed fundamentally. When those buildings were in danger, English heritage, as it was then, said, well, they're just old wartime buildings, they're not important. And there was a massive protest because what had happened in those buildings was more important than the structures. And since then, since that case, which was fought by, well, I certainly fought it, but this is what, 20 years ago? So yes, fought by a lot of academics and designers and computer experts. Lots of people came together and we fought to save those buildings. They're saved, they're now a museum. And many people know the stories behind them. I doubt whether they know what the buildings look like. They're certainly not buildings which English heritage could have considered conserving. But what happened there was so important. So I think the UNESCO example, where UNESCO changed about 20 years ago, and we changed about 20 years ago, I suspect Taiwan should change.
Yes.
You've got to fight the fight. You've got to fight the fight and say, this was important for technology. I mean, the process was interesting in itself. It was important for what happened to us during the war, but it was important also for 2 generations of people who lived there. All these things were important. I think the houses built within the structure are much more interesting than the structure itself. The idea that there were homes built into the structure, I think, is a very important. It says so much about how people lived in Taiwan in those days and who lived there. You know, what sort of workers were there? I think when I was with you, I was saying, did the people who moved in after the war, had they been working for the Japanese? You know, how had they worked? It's an insight, a real human insight into a crucial period in Taiwanese history. The building is the enclosure, but it's what went on there that's so important in 2 ways. The Japanese and what the Japanese did in terms of the technology, and then the human story of the immediate post-war period. So I mean, I would fight that like mad. If I were there, I would fight it like mad, because of all the buildings I've seen, really, it's the I think it's the one that I'm talking about with regards to computers, which is the best model to use. Those huts, which were army huts, were threatened with destruction, and it was only a combination of people who had worked there, people who had been saved by the secrets found there, and computer people who saved those buildings and made a change in thinking. So yes, you've got to fight the fight.
Okay. Yeah.
But remember UNESCO. Remember UNESCO, there is the non-material culture element, which is a recognition that some things are not marked just by buildings. Okay?
Okay. Yeah. The last example you had raised, actually, a couple of months ago, they are doing the structural reinforcement of the big Japanese factory, they
Yeah.
almost torn down all the small houses. We stopped them
Yeah.
because they treat that only as a World War II heritage. And
Well, that's World War II heritage. Those
Yeah,
little houses wouldn't be there if they hadn't been.
what we focus on is that space is like a combination of two generations and two
Well,
different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's at least two generations. It's even more, actually, because it goes right down to the 1990s, doesn't it? When was it vacated?
They vacated on 2013. Actually, it's about 7 years ago. And now they are planning for the third generation of using. So what we focus on is each period of time should have some kind of memories and physical remains of it.
But it's all World War II heritage in terms of both the buildings and the people.
Yes.
They're buying in. I mean, in England, we have a few temporary buildings which were erected in 1946, 47. And many of them are now in museum parks. But there are some groups of them left which have been rehabilitated. And they were supposed to be disposable buildings. Many of them are now listed because what a culture did immediately after the war, how it recovered, is as important as the war. World War II was not an event. It was a massive crisis which led to all sorts of exactly what I was saying at the beginning of the talk. You know, crises exactly. Or conflicts lead to a whole series of changes.
Okay.
So that's down to you. You have to fight that one.
We still keep fighting, and we are this time we have 5 universities and 8 departments of college faculties and students. The students has over 400 students all involved.
I think it's fantastic. I think the way you've mobilized such a large force is excellent.
We were trying to make all these faculties and students as our like a allied force to fight with the local government.
I can just see that. Yes.
Thank you, Brian.
You did pretty well when I was there because we had quite a big audience there and there were a lot of ideas. I think it's great.
And this time, the day after tomorrow, and in the morning, we're going to have a big opening, and your talk is going to like our airline force in UK to fight for the cultural heritage. Well, it's intriguing. I mean, I'm very glad because it was a site that I really enjoyed, but it said many things to me as a place. You know, it's just very interesting. You had a third question, by the way. Oh, the third one you have answered. I try to get a good example, and you just mentioned it. Well,
I think that yes, and I could send you more details eventually if you need them.
Okay.
But the important things to remember were the buildings were wartime buildings of no architectural purpose, but what went on there was of national importance in 2 or 3 areas. So in terms of the whole war effort, in terms of computer technology, and incidentally, in terms of the gay movement, because Turing, who went to court and committed suicide eventually, I think is going to appear on the £50 note now in England. So that shows the change in thinking. And it all relates to that site and what he was doing there. There are several movies about the site, incidentally.
Okay, it's wonderful. Thank you, Brian. I think that.
Thank you. It's been great fun. I mean, it's lovely to see you again. And lovely to talk. I mean, it's great to talk about a project.
It's wonderful. I think the pattern this time we get connected. And in the future, I think this pattern we can use for some other kind of probably other kind of conference or small talk.
Yeah, I think so. Yes. No,
Yeah.
if it works for your students, then it's great. I think.
Yeah. Okay.
So you're going to run what I've said. You're
Yes.
going to insert the illustrations with the text. And
Yeah,
give them the
yeah.
text.
Yeah. And I'm going to put the Chinese translation beneath. Yeah.
No,
Okay.
that's great. Excellent.
Okay.
Well,
Wonderful. Thank you, Brian. And,
thank you very much indeed. It's been great seeing you.
Yeah.
And my regards to, yes, regards to, do you see Stephen?
Yeah.
Because Stephen prompted me to write it.
Yeah.
Give my love to Stephen and say
Yeah,
we're fine. Thank you
Yeah.
very much.
He's still
Okay.
around. He's still around. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, jolly good.
Okay.
All the very best then. Thanks
Okay.
so much.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you. Take care. Yeah.
Okay, and you.
Okay.
Cheerio.
Okay. Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.